Namaskar, friends, and welcome once again. Now, we are going to discuss Interpreter of Maladies, which was published in 1999 and was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. And immediately after this first work by Jhumpa Lahiri, she became a common name among the literatures of the time and sought into fame. And this was something that was unprecedented, as the book got lot of critical acclaim for its depth and richness of the explorations of the life of diasporic people. It's altogether a collection of nine short stories, and these stories explore the lives of Indians and Indian Americans navigating the complexities of identity, cultural dislocation, and the tension between tradition and modernity. And as I said, it won Pulitzer Prize for Fiction for the year 2000 and Hemingway Foundation or Penn Award 2000. Noel Brada Williams argues that the short stories in combination create a short story cycle with nuances of care and neglect that produce a culminative effect on the reader. Ketu H. Katrak reflects the trauma of self transformation through immigration, where broken identities form multiple anchorages. As I said, this is a collection of nine short stories. It begins with the first story, A Temporary Matter, in which Sobha and Sukumar, a married couple in Boston, are grieving the recent loss of their baby. When electric power outages occur, the situation forces them to dine by candlelight, and they begin to share their secrets. And these confessions start small but grow more significant, culminating in Sobha revealing she plans to move out and Sukumar admitting he held their stillborn child. So the darkness allows them to confront their pain, but ultimately they part their ways. And the second story, When Mr. Pirzada Came to Dine, set during the Bangladesh Liberation War. This story follows Lilia, a young Indian American girl whose family regularly hosts Mr. Pirzada, a scholar from Dhaka, separated from his family by the conflict. Through Mr. Pirzada's visit and Lilia's observations, the story explores themes of cultural identity, displacement, and empathy. Lilia learns about the pain of separation and the meaning of missing someone through these visits of Mr. Pirzada. The third story, which is the title story, is significantly, you know, uh, you know, named Interpreter of Maladies, and the whole collection gets its name from this story. In this story, we find that Mr. Kapasi, an Indian tour guide and interpreter, takes the Americanized Das family to a Sun Temple visit, and Mrs. Das confides in him about her affair and resulting guilt, hoping he can interpret her emotional malady. Mr. Kapasi, briefly infatuated, is disillusioned by her confession, and the story ends with a sense of missed connection and unresolved longing. Um, a real Darban is the story of Budima, an elderly woman who serves as the self appointed Darban or doorkeeper of a Calcutta apartment building. And when the residents install a new wash basin, envy and suspicion spread among the tenants. And after the basin is stolen, she is blamed and cast out, highlighting the themes of class displacement and scapegoating. Sexy is another story in which Miranda, a young American woman, has an affair with an Indian married man, Dev, and through her friendship with a young boy named Rohan, Miranda gains insight into the true meaning of sexy and realizes the emptiness of her relationship with Dev, and thus the story explores themes of desire, infidelity, and self discovery. Mrs. Sane is another very important story, um, in which Elliot, a young American boy, is cared for after school by Mrs. Sane, a recent Indian immigrant struggling to adjust to life in the US. She misses her home, especially the social rituals and fresh fish, and her loneliness and inability to adapt culminates in a car accident, ending her time with Eliot and underscoring the isolation of the immigrant experience. So, it's a very important story as far as diasporic experience is concerned. This blessed house, newlywed Sanjeev and Twinkle, Indian immigrants in America, keep finding Christian artifacts in their new home, and Twinkle wants to display them while Sanjeev is uncomfortable. So their differing attitudes towards these discoveries reflect deeper differences in their personalities and marriage, raising questions about compatibility and acceptance. The treatment of Bibi Haldar, a woman in Calcutta with a mysterious illness, is cared by her cousin's family. The community believes marriage might cure her, but no suitor comes forward to accept her. After being abandoned, Bibi is found pregnant, and the father of the child is not identified. And surprisingly, her fits stop, and hence finding fulfillment in motherhood and independence. And the last story, the third and final continent, is again a very important story. And in this story, we find that a young Indian man moves to America after living in London and entering an arranged marriage. He rents a room from Mrs. Croft, an elderly woman, and gradually adjusts to his new life. When his wife Mala joins him, they slowly build a life together. The story is a quiet reflection on adaptation, marriage, and the immigrant journey. So, when we look at this, and if we look at this collection in some detail, we find that it revolves around the theme of displacement and loss of identity, as Rita Moni Nazri opines that the absence of a sense of belonging, the lingering awareness of clutching at a world that does not belong to them, leaves them isolated and willing to create a home, a community in their own way. So, still, there are times, and this is a quote from the third and the final continent, the last story of the collection. Still, there are times I am bewildered by each mile I have traveled, each meal I have eaten, each person I have known, each room in which I have slept. As ordinary as it all appears, there are times when it is beyond my imagination. So the protagonist thinks that how the life has been transformed because of this migration from one place to another, and it's so amazing. So, identity, as Baba observes, is never a priori or is not given, nor a finished product. It is the problematic process of access to an image of totality. And we find this happening if we talk about Mrs. Sen. We find that Mrs. Sen has totalized her whole identity with the ideal image of womanhood. Her desire to fulfill this role as a perfect Indian woman hides the trauma of being an outcast. Mrs. Sen fails to embrace the changing orders and insists on that image of totality, falling into an in betweenness. She dwells in the boundaries of the old and the new social forces, and between the present reality and the past. She desires to reach that image of totality. She cannot transcend her sense of exile. Mrs. Sen feels the possibility of assimilation threatens her traditional cultural identity, so she ensures to openly state her cultural peculiarities by wearing a shimmering white sari patterned with orange paisleys. So we find that Mrs. Sen is a symbol of cultural dislocation. She is intelligent and capable, but paralyzed by her inability to adapt to new environment. Her identity is rooted in family tradition and communal life, all of which are absent in the US. Her obsession with fish is symbolic both of literal and emotional connection to her homeland. Her fear of driving underscores her lack of independence and control in her new life. And so this story, Mrs. Sains, which centers on Indian woman living in an unnamed coastal American town, struggling to adapt to life in the United States, who babysits Ellie, an 11-year-old American boy whose mother works at the university. The story is told through Ellie's perspective, giving us an observant but emotionally neutral view of Mrs. Sain's life. And she is deeply homesick, as I said, as she misses her community and family life and culture in India, where she was never alone. And she consistently longs for Indian food, especially fresh fish, which she does not find. And she does everything to ensure that she is connected with her traditions back home. Alienation and loneliness, this is also very important in this collection, especially when we talk about the title story. And as I said, this story is set in India, that follows Mr. Kapasi, a middle aged Indian man who works as a tour guide for foreign tourists visiting historic sites. He also has a part time job as an interpreter for a doctor, translating symptoms from Gujarati to English for patients. He finds this job dull and unfulfilling until he meets the Das family, Indian Americans visiting India. And the Das family consists of Mr. and Mrs. Das and their three children. And the parents are young, modern, and disengaged from both each other and their children, which is appalling to the Indian sensibility of Kapasi, who has a different view of a family altogether and believes that the parents are always engaged with their children. Um, Mrs. Das is self absorbed and indifferent, more like an older sibling than a mother. And Mr. Kapasi becomes fascinated with Mrs. Das, especially after she expresses interest in his interpreter's job and calls it romantic. So there is also this, lack of cultural communication between the two. um, she is an American with American sensibility, and speaks candidly, and that's why she finds his job romantic. But then Mr. Kapasi, coming from traditional conservative Indian society, takes it to be her love interest in him, and he starts fantasizing about developing an emotional connection with her, imagining a deep correspondence and intellectual companionship. While touring, the family visits the Sun Temple at Konark, Odisha. During the drive, Mrs. Das confesses to Mr. Kapasi that she is deeply unhappy and feels guilty. One of her children was conceived during an affair. She hopes Mr. Kapasi can help her interpret or understand her emotional malady. However, Mr. Kapasi is shocked and disillusioned at this disclosure. He realizes that Mrs. Das does not see him as a confidant or equal. She merely wants quick emotional relief, and his romantic illusions are also shattered. So the story ends with a moment of chaos when one of the children is attacked by monkeys. Mr. Kapasi helps rescue him, but he also notices that a slip of paper with his address, which Mrs. Das had taken earlier, has flown away, symbolizing the fleeting nature of their imagined connection. So, what we find in this particular story, there is theme of miscommunication and emotional isolation, as the story revolves around misunderstandings between cultures, within families, and even within individuals, as Mr. Kapasi notices that this is a very strange kind of family having no real emotional connect. And the sense of loss is not just uh, personal but cultural. The Das family, Indian by heritage but American by upbringing, are shot between two worlds, caught between two worlds, unable to fully belong to either. This cultural displacement leads to a loss of identity and belonging, as they struggle to connect with both their roots and their present environment. Well, they want to look like Americans, but somehow they are not complete Americans as well. And so they really struggle uh, between the two cultures. And there is acute sense of alienation and loneliness, as we find again in Mrs. Sen's. Alienation is portrayed through Mrs. Sen's profound homesickness and inability to adapt to American life. She clings to Indian customs and rituals, but this only deepen her sense of separation. Her struggle to drive, her longing for Indian fish, and her isolation in a foreign land all illustrate the emotional pain and loss that come with migration and cultural dislocation. But when Eliot understood that when Mrs. Sen said home, she meant India, not the apartment where she sat chopping vegetables. So that shows the theme of alienation and loneliness is very acutely expressed in this story. As I said, communication and the complexity of relationships. One of the fragile relationships depicted in the collection is that of marriage. In a temporary matter, we see the final days of Sobha and Sukumar's marriage, which has been disintegrating since Sobha gave birth to a stillborn child. In Sexy again, we find Miranda, the white woman, has an affair with a married man from India named Dev, while her Indian co worker spends time on the phone at work consoling her cousin in India whose husband has left her for a white woman. So, this is all ironical. The infidelity of Mrs. Das also arises as he talks about it to Mr. Kapasi in Interpreter of Maladies, which she has kept a secret from her husband. So, their marriage also lacks proper communication between them, and their relationship is very complex. It is not based on fair play and love, rather, it is a kind of adjustment. And so both have hidden something from each other. So, in Interpreter of Maladies, the material symbol of Kapasi's and Mrs. Das's non connection, the slip of paper with Mr. Kapasi's address on it, fluttering away unnoticed by anyone but Mr. Kapasi, who is left with a mental impression only of the Das family instead of the personal correspondence with Mrs. Das that had anticipated. So, this also shows that there cannot be any enduring relationship between Mr. Kapasi and Mrs. Das, because they both belong to two different cultures. And so his misunderstanding ultimately leads to his self realization that his infatuation for Mrs. Das was a temporary matter and cannot culminate in any kind of enduring relationship. And again, he was disillusioned to note that Mrs. Das has not been loyal to her husband, so obviously not fit for any kind of enduring relationship. So Lahiri's story reiterates, Froster's elegant pessimism concerning human relations. It denies that the malady that comes between people has its origin in race or geographical locations. Although Mr. Kapasi might be able to interpret both his own maladies, of thwarted ambitions and thwarted desire, and those of others, no one can breach the communication gaps that inevitably separate human beings, as it happens between Mr. Kapasi and Mrs. Das. 8 years, Mr. Kapasi, I have been in pain 8 years. I was hoping you could help me feel better, say the right thing, suggest some kind of remedy. Is it really pain you feel, Mrs. Das, or is it guilt? So these are very powerful lines where, Mrs. Das seeks to find a remedy to what she has done, or what secret that she has hidden from her husband, believing that there is a quick fix on the part of Mr. Kapasi. But Mr. Kapasi says that it is not really pain, it is the guilt that you are hiding, and it is really untreatable, because he does not have any remedy for that. Misinterpretation and assumptions, they are also one of the major themes in this novel, as we find both Mr. Kapasi and Mrs. Das misread each other's intentions. Mr. Kapasi fantasizes about the romantic connection, while Mrs. Das only sees him as a confidant who might interpret her emotional pain, not as a lover or friend. And their inability to truly understand each other results in disappointment and further alienation from each other. I quote, "For this reason, it flattered Mr. Kapasi that Mrs. Das was so intrigued by his job. Unlike his wife, she had reminded him of its intellectual challenges. She had also used the word romantic. She did not behave in a romantic way toward her husband, and yet she had used the word to describe him. He wondered if Mr. and Mrs. Das were a bad match, just as he and his wife were." So he misinterprets her calling his job romantic, to an extent that he starts, imagining himself neck deep in love with Mrs. Das, believing that a match may be possible. Cultural conflict is one of the prominent features of any diasporic life, because uh, the people, the diasporic people, are born and raised in one culture, and then shift to another culture, and so their the inherited culture comes in conflict with their adopted culture, and there is perpetual tension between the differing demands of these two cultures. As we find in Mrs. Sen, the concept of home has a special meaning, since it is strongly linked to Mrs. Sen's sense of identity, nationhood, and belonging. Mrs. Sen holds a fixed and radical perspective toward the concepts of home and gender. Her reluctance to integrate into American culture is partly rooted in the established gender expectations and norms within the Indian culture, in which women are considered the guardians and symbol of Indian tradition and spirituality. So we find that there is acute tension within Mrs. Sen, who is reluctant to assimilate in American society and tries utmost best to save his Indian identity and tradition, but in doing that, she is under perpetual stress to balance the reality with imagination. In Interpreter of Maladies, also we find that the Das family, that is Indian by heritage but raised in America, visit India not as Indians but as tourists, and their Americanized behavior, clothing, and attitudes set them apart from their Indian tour guide, Mr. Kapasi, highlighting the gulf between shared ancestry and lived experience. This tension underscores how cultural identity is shaped not just by heritage but also by environment and social context. So, although they are of Indian origin by virtue of being living in America, and subscribing to American culture, they are different from Mr. Kapasi, and Mr. Kapasi finds no reason to really connect to them as Indians. The family looked Indian but dressed as foreigners did, the children in stiff, brightly colored clothing and caps with translucent visors. This is what Kapasi notices, and this immediately makes him feel different about them, although apparently they resemble most of the Indians. Mr. Kapasi pulled over to the side of the road as Mr. Das took a picture of a barefoot man, his head wrapped in a dirty turban, seated on top of a cart of grain sacks, pulled by a pair of bullocks. Both the man and bullocks were emaciated. So, what we find, Mr. Kapasi does not find anything picturesque in this scene. Why? Because this is a common thing in India, where we find that in general the farmers are dressed like that, and there is poverty and malnutrition. But then Mr. Das finds it fascinating, because he is looking at this whole scene um, with a tourist's gaze, not like an Indian, and that's why he is interested in picturing the poor India. So his camera not only marks his role as a tourist in India, viewing the country from a distance, but also highlights his family's affluence compared to the people around them. The camera, a symbol of their American wealth and bicultural identity, emphasizes the stark economic divide between the Das family and those they come across, such as the barefoot, emaciated man Mr. Das photographs. So, this contrast reflects the broader gap between the prosperity of America and the widespread poverty in India. Um, Her debut collection of short stories, this Interpreter of Maladies, marks the beginning of a new era in studying the South Asian diaspora and the complexities of cultural translation and interpretation, as observed, as decoded with the story of Mrs. Sen. The notions of cultural difference, cross cultural communication and translation, and an individual transformation are presented through the interaction between the two characters and the comparisons Eliot makes between his mother and babysitter. In contrast to the leading female character of Mrs. Sains, who fails to create a sense of home in the United States because of her disinterest in negotiating with the new world around her, the narrator's mother in When Mr. Pirzada Came to Dine is depicted as a hybrid woman who has managed to maintain the familial and friendship bond in a foreign soil. So we come across a motley multitude of diasporic characters in these stories, who all have different experiences and respond to their conditions differently. The final story of the collection, the third and final continent, depicts the optimistic dimension of migration and cross cultural communication, and seems to be coming to terms with the diasporic need to balance one's life between the home culture and the host culture. So, in this story, we find that finally the novelist also tries to engage with the positive aspect of diaspora. The story is a reflective and ultimately optimistic story narrated by an unnamed Indian man who moves from India to London to the United States in 1960s, very much like the father of the novelist, and that's why it is a kind of semi autobiographical piece inspired by Lahiri's father's immigration journey. After receiving a job at MIT, the narrator travels from London to Boston, very much like the father of Jhumpa Lahiri. While waiting for his wife Mala to arrive from India in an arranged marriage, he rents a room in a house owned by Mrs. Croft, a 103-year-old eccentric and formidable uh, woman, and she insists on decorum and reverence, especially for the moon landing, which she considers splendid. Despite her age and strictness, the narrator grows fond of her, and she becomes a symbol of endurance and quiet dignity. When Mala arrives, the narrator feels awkward and distant from her, but their shared visit to Mrs. Croft acts as a turning point, and Mala treats the old woman with kindness and respect, and something shifts in the narrator's perception. Over time, he grows to love Mala. So now, decades later, the narrator looks back from place of contentment, reflecting on the challenges and successes of immigration, marriage, and building a life in a new land. So this is the final story, and it's different in the sense it talks about the positive aspect of diaspora. um, a quote from the story: while the astronauts, heroes forever, spent more hours on the moon, I have remained in this new world for nearly 30 years. I know that my achievement is quite ordinary. I am not the only man to seek his fortune far from home, and certainly I am not the first. Still, there are times I am bewildered by each mile I have traveled, each meal I have eaten, each person I have known, each room in which I have slept. As ordinary as it all appears, there are times when it is beyond my imagination. So, in the story of a diasporic subject who experiences life on three continents, as this story, Asia, Europe, and America, we find how the protagonist translates these three different lifestyles and is continually involved in the process of hybridity. And so finally, she believes that the life of a diasporic subject is ever evolving and calls for redefinition of self in evolving circumstances, and only those people who take pride in this evolutionary journey are the people who survive, like the protagonist of this story. The title story, Interpreter of Maladies, gives us an American born Indian family on vacation in India, strangers to their own culture and heritage, and it is fitting that this is the tale after which Lahiri titles her collection, because it highlights so clearly the sense of distance from their Indian heritage that a common thread among so many of the characters in this collection. So, Aruti Nair also observes Lahiri negotiates the dilemmas of the cultural spaces lying across the continents with a master's touch. Though endowed with a distinct universal appeal, her stories do bring out the Indians who tapes between and across two traditions, one inherited and the one left behind, and the other encountered but not necessarily assimilated. So, friends, this particular collection is a very powerful depiction of the life of diaspora, and certainly calls for special attention, and adds to our understanding of the intricate world of diasporic subjects, in which we find all the different diasporic people struggle in their own way and respond to that struggles in their own typical way. Um, and ultimately, it is all about finding a way to survive, so resilience or adapting, or there are people like Mrs. Sen who never reconcile to these two disparate worlds, and continues to live on the margins, seeth herself in nostalgia. And there are people like the protagonist of the third and final continent who take pride in whatever they have achieved in their life, howsoever little it may be compared to the great achievements made by people. So, there are different ways to cope up with the diasporic condition and reality. And through this powerful narrative, Jhumpa Lahiri, throws this diverse world of diaspora in front of the readers, to make them realize how different people have different course of action, different ways to mend their maladies or interpret their situation. So, friends, I hope you find this discussion meaningful, and we'll continue this discussion in the next class, talking about yet another diasporic text or diasporic writer. Till then, these are the references. I thank you very much for your kind company. Thank you very much.